Good evening. We are delighted to have with us two esteemed speakers and thought leaders to discuss about an important topic, devastating impact of the second wave of COVID-19 on the Indian economy. Before I start, let me introduce my esteemed panel members to all of you. And I'm sure all of us are interested to know what will be the impact of the second wave on the Indian economy. Let me start with Mr. Abhik Barua. Mr. Abhik Barua is Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of HDFC Bank. He has been in the financial sector for 27 years now. He has been earlier with CRISIL, Merrill Lynch, and SSKI Securities. His previous assignment was as Chief Economist, ABN AMRO Bank. He has advised the Planning Commission, the RBI, the Finance Minister, and the Prime Minister. He has periodically been a member of a group consulted by the RBI Governor on monetary policy. He's a member of the bank's Apex Asset Liability Committee. He has also been a member of key consultative committees of the Indian Banks Association, CII, and the Bombay Chamber of Commerce. He's a regular commentator on television, writes a regular column for Economic Times, and is a regular speaker at finance and economics conferences both in India and abroad. He was educated at the Delhi School of Economics and the University of Maryland, USA. Thank you, Mr. Barua, for taking time out for this webinar.
Pleasure.
Let me introduce my second esteemed panel member, Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh. Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh is the director of ORF Kolkata. He also mentors the SDG and Blue Economy program across all ORF's centers. His previous positions at various points in time include Senior Fellow and Head of Economics at ORF Kolkata, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at MCX Limited in India, in Mumbai, and Professor of Econometrics at Teddy School of Advanced Studies, New Delhi. Dr. Ghosh has recently been appointed by the Honorable Supreme Court of India as a member of expert committee for formulating scientific and policy guidelines with respect to cutting trees for developmental projects. Dr. Ghosh has been a visiting fellow to a number of universities abroad. He's a leading ecological economist and development analyst, and is considered pioneer in the application of neoclassical and heterodox economics in water governance. He obtained his PhD from IIM Kolkata. He has more than 65 publications in reputed journals to his credit. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for taking time out for this webinar.
Thank you. Pleasure is entirely.
Before I start, let me tell you about some of the rules for this webinar. Of course, we'd like to take questions from the audience. So I request you to post your questions on the chat. Let the questions be a little short so that we can accommodate many questions. And also please mention the name of the panel member to whom you are asking the question. And so after 15-20 minutes, I'll try to collect some of the questions and read them for the panel members and will request the panel members to respond to them. Thank you. So let us start with the webinar. So I will start with the main question, actually the theme of the webinar. So about the impact of the devastating second wave on the Indian economy. We all thought that probably we won the battle against COVID-19 after the first wave, but the second wave actually caught us unaware. And the response to second wave was a little different from that of the first wave. First wave, it was nationwide lockdown. Second wave, on the other hand, it was less stringent, more localized. And before the second wave, economy was also showing signs of recovery. So my question to both the panel members, first with Mr. Barua, and then I would like to request Dr. Nilanjan to respond to that. So what do you think, what has been the impact of the second wave on the Indian economy, and what will be the impact in the coming months? Mr. Barua, please.
So let me try and quantify the impact as a macroeconomist. So if you remember, in the first quarter of the fiscal year 2021, when COVID hit, there was a nationwide lockdown, as we mentioned, and that had a huge impact on economic activity. So economic activity as measured by the GDP went down by 26%. So the expectation was that if things had remained kind of normal, if the second wave did not happen, then we would have a growth rate of around 22 to 23%. It seems a lot, but remember that this is coming off a very low base for contraction. So negative 26% is the base, and you have 22, 23% pick up over that. Now, what has happened, and if you look at the range of estimates, the growth rate has changed for the first quarter. The expected growth rate has changed for the first quarter of the current fiscal year from the 22% that I was talking about all the way down to 15, 16%. What does it mean for growth for the economy for the year? So earlier we were kind of sanguine that the economy would, after a contraction or degrowth of around 7.5%, the economy would grow by around 11 to 12%. Now that has been scaled down, and the range of forecasts is between 8.5 to 9.5%. This might not seem very dramatic, but in terms of GDP, 1 percentage point is a lot. So you can imagine what the impact is. Having said that, I think one of the points that you made was the response to the second wave was different. We did not have, we tried to do localized lockdowns, which ultimately sort of, because of the number of states that had to kind of move beyond localized lockdowns, ultimately turned into a sort of a semi-nationwide lockdown. But the restart, both because of the localization of the containment, as well as the fact that we had learned to kind of live and cope with the virus, has been rather quick, much quicker than with the first wave. So we've kind of come out of the second wave in sort of on a sequential basis at a more rapid clip than we did from the first wave. So this is broadly the state of play. What I've learned from the pandemic is to have a lot of humility as an economist, and it all all these forecasts are completely contingent on how the virus evolves, whether we have a third wave, fourth wave, what the kind of mutation is like. But broadly, the impact seems to be at least confined to the first quarter of this year, the second wave quarter, and the growth rate is likely to be 9%, which means that we will reach the pre-pandemic GDP level somewhere in the first quarter of the calendar year 2022. I have said a lot. I'll let Nilanjan talk about the rest.
Is Dr. Nilanjan?
Yeah, thank you, Shangita. Thank you, Mr. Durga. I think that was quite a lucid and quite a nice background presentation on how the macroeconomy is going to unfold as a response to the second wave. My concern is, of course, a bit different. In fact, it's not that I'm only looking at the second wave. As a development economist, or rather, suppose say working in the domains of SDGs, and especially, in fact, looking at equity and distributive justice, my concern has always been with the equity and the distributional aspects of the development paradigm, and which became extremely prominent during the times of crisis, both these waves together. Yes, the economy actually contracted by 23.9%. In fact, in the first quarter of the last financial year, we witnessed a negative economic growth overall. But we seem to have forgotten a few other issues. That is the concerns of the migrant workers, unorganized sectors, daily wages, non-pension senior citizens, marginal farmers not connected to the markets, though in fact they are getting featured in the media almost every day at one point in time. Now, what happens? What are the lessons that we learned out of it, out of both these? Now, in an economic system, left to work by itself, there are often forces emanated by the market that can take care of the problems of the economically marginalized through small businesses, informal employment, and suppose say the overall informal sector. This is organic in nature. Now, what happens in a lockdown is it completely blocks the working of the market forces. Therefore, a capitalist or a semi-capitalist system that is more geared towards markets to take care of the concerns of the underprivileged through an organic process has to conduct its course correction. Now, it now becomes the onus of the government to take care of the various distributional needs of the society. So the response needs to be extremely Keynesian in nature, or neo-Keynesian in nature. Now, it is a known fact that social security in India has been in shambles ever since independence, and no government, let me repeat, no government has so far revealed any intention to correct this folly. There have been only blarney talks and tall claims without implementation, while often there is a tendency for many to defend governmental initiatives by putting forward arguments in favor of Manrega employment generation schemes. They're hardly adequate. The pains and anguishes of migrant workers in the lockdown nation last year brought to the fore the crucial roles that the market forces played so far and where the governments failed summarily. Now, the governmental failure is also evident when it comes to non-pension senior citizens. Now, this is not a phenomenon, in fact, happening precisely because of the lockdown. In the name of promoting private investment and helping businesses, while it is good that interest rates need to be brought down, the governments over the years have been completely oblivious of the fact that senior citizens retire with a fixed pool of fund with almost no further accrual of incomes. They completely rely on the interests of the fixed savings, nothing beyond that. Now, over time, of course, there are inflationary pressures, and when you take the inflation adjustments of the incomes, of the interest incomes, what you find is that the purchasing power has been shrinking over time. So there are two forces working. One is the lowering of the inflation of the interest rates. The other is the inflation. So this cannot be the tenet of what was presented, in fact, in one of the previous budgets, tenet of caring society. This cannot be the tenet of a caring society. Now, there is no doubt that widespread apprehensions of poverty, hunger, unemployment have brought about a feeling that the government has its role to play as market forces cannot do under the lockdown. Now, pandemics generally, of course, it's also going to be true for the second wave, as Mr. Barua rightly pointed out. Pandemics generally have been associated with economic slumps. I mean, this is historically, empirically proven, empirically witnessed. And this was long recognized by Russian economist Nikolai Kondratiev, who popularized the K waves. And this was later acknowledged as business cycles in the writings of Paul Samuelson and many others. And it is here that the government's role becomes prominent, both as a driver of investment and growth, and also as an enabler of distribution. Now, in this context, one very important thing has to be acknowledged. Over the last 30 years, ever since our liberalization, the Indian growth story has been a consumption-led growth story. And the consumption has been decelerating ever since 2017-18 onwards. And eventually what we find, in fact, in the last few estimates is that consumption has decelerated substantially. And one of the reasons for the slump in economic growth, of course, has to be attributed to this deceleration in consumption. Now, on the other hand, let me also bring about a working hypothesis. Essentially, what happens is that the inequality has been increasing as far as India is concerned, both in terms of wealth inequality as also income inequality. Now, in fact, the marginal propensity to consume of the rich and the super rich is substantially lower than the middle class and the lower middle class, or even the poor. So what is happening in here is, when in fact the incomes are getting concentrated, this is in a few hands, this is also impacting the consumption base. And that is also one of the reasons for which I'm not too hopeful until and unless the distributional aspects of consumption are being taken care of. And of course, because we are operating in a low base, we are definitely going to have 9% or even double-digit growth figures over the next few quarters. But that is not adequate. Of course, we simply cannot think of a $5 trillion economy at this point in time. Even last year, when we had shrunk by double digit, I think at 12% or 13% in the entire financial year, we had to, we were slated, we had to grow by around 22 or 23% if we had to reach that $5 trillion figure by 2024. That is no more possible. So that's a distant dream. Let's keep that in abeyance. So the issue is that how are we going to get in there and by which time? So let me stop in here.
Thank you, Dr. Nilanjan, for bringing in that development perspective. Very important. Mr. Barua, I have a question to you regarding the policy responses. Now, RBI has been taking measures to ease the liquidity and the financing condition. So what is your take on the policy responses, monetary policy responses to the pandemic? And do you think that whatever steps taken are fine, or you think something else could have been done?
No, let me make a broad point and kind of assert that I'm on the same page as Nilanjan. I think at some level, macroeconomic numbers become meaningless, because if you are not looking at the distributional aspects of growth, and whether in your sort of policy response, you are really taking care of the dispossessed and needy. And I think what has happened is, I strongly believe that the fiscal response in terms of not stimulus, but fiscal support for the really vulnerable sections of the population have been far from adequate, right? So I think there is a huge policy gap. Of course, I mean, one can see it at two levels. One is it's sort of exposed, as Nilanjan was saying, has exposed the chinks in our armor of, following a purely sort of, in a sense, a market-driven model, and depending on the market to take care of a lot of things where traditionally we know that there has been market failure. And so I think we are looking at a situation where the lack of institutions, of mechanisms, etc., to take care of people who have been hit by this huge shock, has proved to be inadequate. And the only way we could do it was through a fiscal response, which I think has been tepid relative to the needs. But let me sort of get to monetary policy. The playbook as it has emerged, and this is a playbook that emerged with the great financial crisis, is how do you take care of a deep economic downturn, which follows either a crisis in the financial markets, which happened with the 2008 financial crisis, or how do you take care of a pandemic-driven economic shock when there is a downturn? To put it very simply, the RBI's strategy is to throw money at the problem. So you just create a lot of, I'm just putting it simplistically because I presume this is it's a non-specialist audience. So the RBI has created a lot of money, tried to target some of this money to sections which are more vulnerable, small enterprises, microfinance institutions, etc. But this, instead of a direct sort of line of infusion to these segments, it has depended on the banks to do this. So banks have been given money at a sort of a cheaper rate in order to, with the hope that they will lend to sections or categories that service the more vulnerable. So the RBI has done its bit, but a lot of it hasn't, a lot of the money hasn't actually reached the vulnerable sections, like the really small companies in the SME sector, or to the microfinance institutions, because of two reasons. Banks perceive an elevated risk in lending to these institutions, justifiably so. And number two, I think there is an issue of demand. A lot of small production units or even self-help groups, which typically dependent on the microfinance route, have simply their production activities have been damaged by this pandemic. So I think, again, a more direct outreach was perhaps necessary. And the irony of this is, I understand that India has more fiscal constraints than the Western developed countries. But I think it's really the so-called, the capitalist world, which has shown a much bigger heart, if you like. And if you look at the kind of support that the US or the UK or even Europe has extended to the really needy, has been far more than us. Perhaps we couldn't have done that much, but certainly more could have been done. I'll stop there.
I totally agree with Mr. Barua. I think probably we're short of what we should have done. Now, Dr. Nilanjan, there's a question for you from one of our students. So before we move forward, maybe I would like to ask that question. So, okay, Apurva has got a question for Dr. Nilanjan as well as for Mr. Barua. So for Dr. Nilanjan, her question is that she wants to know your viewpoint that what he thinks when government waive off the loans or give unnecessary subsidiary. Don't the government should make them this much effective that they should not leave on mercy, and how this affect the economy? This is a question by Apurva to Nilanjan. Probably, I think she's asking about government waiving of loans and giving subsidies, I think. Subsidy, I guess. Yes, subsidy. And so what's the, how it's impacting the economy? So she's basically asking that, is government right in waiving of loans and giving subsidy?
So if you are talking of farm loans or suppose any form of loan, well, it's a much more complicated process. Of course, there are n number of reasons of not doing so. First and foremost, after we are now, in fact, this is the 75th year of Indian independence. And if I take it from the plan period, we have 70 years of ever since the first plan happened. Now, even at this phase, the Indian agricultural sector has not matured and has to live on subsidies. Agricultural income is not taxed. Those subsidies have been reduced quite a bit. Farm loan waivers are often given. That is also a fact. Not only that, Mr. Barua will definitely be in a better position to state how much pressure it creates, in fact, on the financial sector, especially the banks, when farm loans are waived off. And not only that, we don't even have the right type of instruments. The banks or the financial instruments institutions often don't have the right type of instruments to hedge. In fact, in the derivatives markets or all other markets, when this shock of a farm loan waiver essentially comes. So naturally, in many cases, loans turn out to be bad loans, often need to be written off or whatever. Something needs to be done about it. The fact remains that I can come to this later. The large-scale subsidization that happens in the agricultural sector has essentially been unhealthy because it has not been well thought of. The initial subsidies that were given were not really to make the agricultural sector stand on its feet, but to make it more dependent. Ideally, what should have happened? Ideally, the thing is that, okay, fine, you need protection in the initial phases. And after that, you have to stand on your feet. But that didn't happen. Suppose, say, even if you think about the Green Revolution, what was the Green Revolution all about? the green revolution was essentially, it was need of the hour. But look at the crops that were promoted out of green revolution. And that eventually led to a complete redelineation of our food security. Changed the definition of food security and made it confined to two specific crops, two specific cereals, rice and wheat. And this is a huge phenomenon which I can come to later, because even if you see the minimum support price, which is a support price in the sense, if the market price falls below the minimum support price, you can always sell it to the state procurement agency at the minimum support price. This is some kind of a put option, which is offered by the government. So what happens is that it is the Food Corporation of India and the state procurement agencies who actually procure rice and wheat effectively at the minimum support price. But as far as other crops are concerned, they have not really been looked at. Suppose say the millets, the jowar, bajra and ragi. And eventually the farmers find that it is extremely lucrative to produce rice and wheat, precisely because the minimum support price of rice and wheat has been increasing over time and increasing at a much faster rate than the drier alternatives. One of the reasons for water conflicts happening in India is the minimum support price, because the acreage pattern essentially changed from the drier alternatives, especially in the Kaveri basin, because that's the most celebrated water conflict in India. The acreage pattern from the 1960s and the 70s changed from ragi to paddy as response to the increase in the minimum support prices, which started affecting the market price. Apart from that, water remains largely subsidized, and there is no efficiency parameter. There is no average cost pricing or marginal cost pricing of water. And eventually there is reprehensible wastage of water in the agricultural sector. The entire water productivity of most of these water consuming crops, if you look, somebody estimates the average product of water or the yield of this water of these particular crops, we are one of the lowest in the world. As far as paddy productivity is concerned, we rank at maybe at the bottom. In fact, China's paddy productivity is around 6 to 8 times of that of ours. Why is that the case? What kind of unsustainable agricultural practices did we promote? What kind of unsustainable subsidization did we promote in the system which has led us here? And even today, you simply can't touch that sector. So it is not merely from the perspective of the poor farmers that I am talking of. I'm also talking from the perspective of sustainability, from the perspective of the environment, reprehensible wastage of natural resources and natural capital, as also the fact that we have an extremely low yield. So yes, I completely agree with this particular statement that there have been, it has not really been from the perspective of sustainability that things have been looked at.
There are a couple of questions, I think one for Mr. Barua and one for Dr. Ghosh. We can take up the question and after that we can move forward with our discussions. So this question is from Barun. I am assuming that this question I think is from Mr. Barua. So, so basically he has given that COVID pandemic has acted as a catalyst and transforming every industry practically. So what he's asking is that should the management should adapt to the new normal? Is it not an absolute requirement of the I think it's probably it's I think both Dr. Ghosh and Mr. Barua, you can talk about it. Is that what about the organization adapting to the new normal? What is your take on that? So this is a question. So one of the questions. So what is your take on organization adapting to the new normal?
I'm going to now talk from a very sort of a company, sort of take off my macroeconomist hat and talk from a company perspective. I think the transition to the new normal is proving to be far more challenging than we had initially thought. One of the aspects of one of the sort of principal aspects of the new normal is digital participation in the workspace, which is a fancy way of saying work from home. Companies have company offices, etc., with traditional physical contact have developed a culture of a corporate culture, a culture of sharing ideas, of solving problems together, etc., and also of a certain amount of social support that you get from the confines of your office and your colleagues. I think initially it seemed like a very attractive option to have work from home across the board. But I think there is, and this is not a trivial issue, but I think there is a lot of fatigue and mental health problems that are creeping in to the workforce because of this inability to kind of separate work from home, and when you're constantly so I think this is a huge organizational challenge, which might seem trivial, but it could sort of just lead to problems that were unanticipated, and I think that a lot of companies are moving back to at least partial physical presence in the office if the infection continues to be contained. So that's one aspect of it, which, having said that, I think it's also sort of made us sensitize us to the fact that better work-life balance is perhaps possible. You can have part work from home, part work from office, and balance some of your personal needs along with your work commitments. So hopefully the new normal, I think there are a lot of unknowns about what the new normal is going to be, but clearly there will be far more digital participation, digital work, digital transactions. I think companies, including banks, will have to gear up for that. There will be the challenges of that typically organizations face of kind of permeating and getting people used to the culture of the company, the values, the ethos of the company. I think that is very critical. That's a difficult territory to navigate. Yeah, so I think my issue is, and I think there has been a lot of writing in the media on this, that the next problem that we will face is a huge mental health epidemic, which is coming from isolation, which is coming from this inability to differentiate between your home and your workplace. And I just hope in the new normal, while a lot of things might seem very nice in digital work and etc., but some of the more human aspects of contact with physical contact with people, of just being able to talk face to face. I don't know if you jettison all that suddenly. I don't know what the psychological costs are, but my guess is that they're fairly large.
Mr. Barua, thank you so much. You touched upon some very important aspects. Dr. Nilanjan, would you like to add to this? This is something, we are talking about the impact on the economy, but the impact on the mental.
Completely agree with Avigdor on this, because this definitely has. I have a tendency of theorizing things. So Avigdor put this across in a very succinct manner. Now, what happens is, what has been the biggest victim of this pandemic? If I at all look at the bigger economy as functions of 4Ks or 4 capital theories, say the natural capital, the physical capital, the human capital, and the social capital. the biggest victim has been human capital. Now, the productivity of human capital is being augmented by all other three capitals. Of course, natural capital has its own fundamental base by way of which it provides us with a host of means of production. Physical capital, of course, does it. But social capital out here is extremely crucial because that is essentially, I would say, a critical factor which enhances the entire value of leisure. And value of leisure is important to enhance the marginal product of labor. And therefore, social capital becomes, as Abhigda stated, that we are simply not interacting. Out here also, in fact, I can only see 3 faces, but there might be 28 other faces which are there, which are only asking questions by typing in the keyboard. I would have loved to see those faces, but I can't see them. And this social process, social, institutional, cultural issues, this is something that has been deterred, that has somehow been stifled by the pandemic. Of course, on the other hand, let me, if I at all look at this entire phenomenon, it has also reduced the entire transaction cost of conducting this particular workshop. Because otherwise, had it been a physical seminar, then all of us had to move to your space, maybe in fact in a seminar hall, and waste an entire day by flying or traveling. So there are both pros and cons of this entire process. Definitely, on the one hand, while it has indeed increased the labor productivity, on the other hand, it is causing immense distress. There's no doubt about that. Now, how do we augment this social capital? In what ways? Probably the combination that Mr. Barua talked about becomes, having that kind of a work-life balance, at least going to office once or twice a week, and then in fact working from home. This seems to be a much more a better solution than what prevails at this point in time, especially in times of lockdowns.
Let me just qualify this by saying that these answers are coming from the group discussing this. The 3 of us discussing this are all Bengalis with a very strong love for chatting, which we call adda. So perhaps this is a cultural bias that is being expressed, but we love to get together. We love to sit and talk for hours. So I think for us, maybe the absence of social capital, the absence of interaction is perhaps a little more acute than for other ethnic groups. But I think that this is a more general problem and not just confined to Bengalis.
Yeah, but I guess it's not. Yeah, maybe more for us, but I guess it's affecting everyone. So coming back to, I have a couple of questions for both of you. Maybe I'll start with Dr. Nilanjan. I want to, because I think last year we were discussing about this new economic order, even before the pandemic, where the Brexit, US-China trade war, this insulating tendency of the economies. So my question to you: do you think that now there's also new president has come in USA? Do you think the economic order, the change in the economic order that you were talking about last year, is still there? And if it's there, if a new economic order is actually emerging, so how will India position itself?
Frankly speaking, it's very, very difficult for me to give a very definitive response to this question. We are again in a state of transition. Yes, it is a fact that we have a new president in the United States, and which, of course, has negated the very Trumpian disregard of the climate change crisis. That's the only thing that has happened. There has been, as far as the insulating tendency of the US is concerned, when it withdrew from the TPP, the prolonged US-China trade war, we might see another trade war happening at any point in time. But the most significant development, in fact, that happened over, I would say, when you conducted an interview with me last year till today, is there are two developments. One is, uh, of course, the change in the US government. Second is better formalization of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific. Definitely, China's ascendance on the one hand was, the Quad is more of a response of China's ascendance in the Indo-Pacific, as also, in fact, in the South China Sea, the way they have been exploiting things. But this pandemic actually made the quadrilateral, especially, India, Japan, US, and Australia, a bit more determined to formalize this grouping. So that sends across a strong statement across. Now, if I talk about whether this is going to lead to a new economic order, I'm not too sure. The other significant development that has happened is that India has come out of the regional comprehensive economic partnership negotiation. It's no more part of that RCEP group, though in fact there are claims that though India has come out, the members are always stating that you can always come back and essentially get into the RCEP. But that doesn't seem to be in the offing, at least in the near future. So there are, of course, a host of voices within and outside India that feels that India has missed on the bus by not being a member of this mega trade deal. And probably India could have been one of the critical drivers, though in fact, I feel otherwise. That first of all, it's a pity that even after 30 years of Indian independence, Indian industry has not matured to that extent. The very idea that Indian MSMEs can integrate effectively into the ASEAN value chain is still a working hypothesis, not really backed by any data or empirical analysis. Rather, the possibility of things working in the opposite direction seems more probable, given the existing inefficiencies and lack of competitiveness of the sector as compared to the ASEAN or, in fact, other nations of the RCEP participating countries. Now, we have a host of inefficiencies in our labor markets, which are even today, they are fragmented, incapacitated by whatever reforms you bring about. Even then, in fact, in the labor laws, they're not really sufficient. The low average productivity still prevails in the industrial sector. Our silver lining happens to be the services. Now, this inefficiency is not only limited to the factor markets. We also have a GST, which is not really competitive at this point in time. There's a huge cost of compliance to the GST norms. We have some 5 to 6 slabs of GST. The cost of compliance turns out to be high every month. You have to essentially declare, and there are 2 or 3 forms that you have to fill in and get into things. Even look at the hedging cost in the Indian commodity, or suppose say transaction costs in Indian commodities and stock exchanges. India happens to be the only nation in the world which has a commodity transaction tax. Probably Taiwan has it, but because it's merged under with the stock exchanges. But there is no other nation in the world which has a CTT, or a commodity transaction tax. So eventually, the transaction cost of doing business in India, if you compare the other RPCs that are participating nations, is extremely high, except for Cambodia, Laos, and Philippines. Even if I go back to the ease of doing business parameters, considering all these members, all these nations are members of the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, except for Cambodia, Laos, and Philippines. All other RPCs rank higher than India in terms of ease of doing business. So why should somebody invest in India if India really becomes a part of the RCEP? So these questions are still there. So it is highly unlikely that RCEP would have been beneficial either for the Make in India or Atmanirbhar Bharat perspective. So definitely there's a long way to go. I still presume that we need some big bang reforms at this point in time, especially in the industrial sector and the MSMEs.
Thank you, Dr. Nilanjan. basically the objective of this webinar is to actually touch upon various aspects. But one thing which we all are concerned about is the high inflation. So this question is for Mr. Barua. So, the inflation rate is high. In June, it crossed the threshold limit of RBI 6%. So, what do you think? What is your take on that? How can we control it? And what are the monetary policy challenges to navigate the path between high inflation and slow growth rate?
Let me just, take a minute to talk about what Nilanjan spoke and take it at a sort of broader level. And I'll try to answer the question: is the pandemic the decisive end to globalization, which is a trend that was growing with Trump, with Brexit, and so forth? And if you look at the supply chain literature, so globalization was premised on interconnected supply chains. So a company in the US was sourcing from Latin America, which in turn was sourcing from Asia and so forth. So you had a very large, complex, interrelated sort of network of supply points. So if you look at the Trump agenda of reshoring jobs in the US, it was sort of going against this globalization, the logic of globalization, and cheap labor and low cost of production, and getting jobs back to sectors where the US was, following, traditional economic theory, was uncompetitive. Now, I think what the pandemic has done is perhaps, put another case for going against globalization and having more localization. Because if you have a localized production system, then if another crisis were to happen, maybe it's not a pandemic, but maybe it's something related to climate change. Maybe it's a huge flood in somewhere in Asia. Then your production system in the US is not going to be affected, because you are dependent on that key, input from Cambodia. So I think it could be twisted around. If you are against globalization, it could be sort of played out as a further case against globalization and for localization, and which kind of extends the nationalist, nativist agenda that arose both in Europe and the US. Trump, Brexit, the rise of the National Front in France, and so forth. Sorry. So I digressed. But let me take the question of inflation. It's indeed a very, very difficult call, because I personally think that there is one key factor that is responsible for a lot of the build-up in inflation. I'm talking about retail inflation, and that is the horrendously high fuel taxes that we have, the combination of state VAT and central excise. And I think there's something profoundly morally wrong about taxing a commodity that goes into that people use across the board in transport, communication, in transport, in getting from one place to another, etc., which is a inelastic, mass consumed product at over 200%. So I think we might not sort of migrate to GST immediately, but something needs to be done urgently on that front, and I think we have the space to do it. And were that to be done, I think we would have a lot of beneficial effects on inflation, because this tends to have a sort of a multiplier effect across categories, and this will bring overall inflation down. Having said that, there are still key components which in things like health and so forth. My sense is that these reflect, as going back to Nilanjan's point, that these reflect chronic supply bottlenecks in very, very critical areas that like health, that have now got sort of highlighted in your inflation stats because of the sudden acceleration in the need for healthcare. I'm not too sure how much these structural bottlenecks can be handled through monetary policy. So I would say that to the extent that you can fix the supply side, focus on that, keep monetary policy relatively easy, perhaps normalize to a limited extent. But I don't think the solution to the inflation problem today is really lies in the hands of the. This is an unconventional thing to say, but really doesn't lie in the hands of the central bank. And if the central bank, which is doing all the heavy lifting for the for any kind of economic revival, were to suddenly turn contractionary or whatever, it will be very disruptive for the economy. And I understand that inflation is like a very regressive tax, but and it affects the more vulnerable, the dispossessed more. But to handle inflation, I think we need more very aggressive supply side initiatives rather than use monetary tools beyond a point.
I totally agree with Mr. Barua. I think India is in an inherently supply constrained economy, and we have to look at those aspects more than trying to control it through monetary policy. I think we try to control inflation mainly through monetary policy, but we have to look at the bottlenecks in our supply chain. That is very, very important to control inflation. I think we've come to the end, but there are many questions. I think let me take up a couple of questions, maybe one for Mr. Barua and one for Dr. Nilanjan before we wrap up this edition of the webinar. Let me check the questions that are. So Anirban Gupta has a question for Dr. Nilanjan. How long will the second wave continue to overshadow growth? This is, and Anirban Mitra has a question for Mr. Barua. Your take on the pressure on banks with the increasing NPA level, especially during pandemic. So maybe a couple of questions, both Anirban's, and one for the NPA, Mr. Barua, about on the pressure of NPA on banks.
Well, yeah, yes, there will certainly be an increase in NPA. The RBI released a report, a stress test, which is it's kind of a forecast of NPAs sometime in September. They've released one more recently, and although there is a significant increase, it is much less than the previous round of the stress test. NPAs will rise, but I think we have now have systems in place which can perhaps more effectively take care of stress loans. We have the bad bank coming up. We are trying to revamp the IBC, etc. So perhaps we can handle it better. But this is a legacy issue. This is a problem that has been there for about more than 10 years now. So it's not going to go away in a hurry, and the pandemic has only made it worse. I just hope some of the systems that have been put in place and the efforts that are on help us tackle the system further. The only thing is that you have to look at the banking system in two parts. There is one very healthy part of the banking system, adequately capitalized, have all their parameters in a ship shape. They can sort of take on the burden of delivering credit to the economy, and then there's a bunch of banks which are largely in the public sector that are hobbled by lack of capital, etc. So if your concern is whether the rising NPA levels will cripple the recovery, I don't think so, because it's really you have to look at it in this disaggregated dual structure.
Okay, thank you so much. I think Dr. Ghosh, there's a question.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to answer. Is that how long the pandemic will overshadow our growth? It's very difficult to give the timeline, but would you like to?
Difficult to give the timeline as far as the second is concerned, because we don't know whether the third is coming. And if that comes, then again, whether there is going to be another bout of lockdowns or not. But the fact remains that the counteractive forces, as far as the third wave is concerned, are already in vogue. First of all, the health infrastructure seems to be much more ready, much more prepared than what it was prior to the second wave. Second is, of course, this entire vaccination drive that is happening. So one can be pretty hopeful that as far as the second wave is concerned, the impact is not going to be there for long, because things are opening up. Definitely, it's going to be in a much better force over time. And as we are operating at a lower base than what we were in 2019, definitely the growth rates, which Mr. Barua mentioned at the very beginning, naturally the growth rates are going to be higher. Now, the bigger concern is that to push the consumption levels up. Now, if you recall, some of the more growth ambitious economies like China actually depended largely on consumption. This is something very interesting that China did. It's not that we need to follow the Chinese model, because the Chinese model till a point in time was a very export-oriented growth model. But over time, from 2007-8, if somebody even reads the 13th and the 14th five-year plans of China lately, the entire framework, the entire model is stated as consumption-led growth. Now, they want to increase the final consumption figure, which is presently at around 40-42%, to 60% by 2025. This is also because of 2-3 factors. First of all, from 2008-9, China found that as far as the external forces are concerned, that is not going to yield the kind of impetus to their growth, precisely because from 2008-9 onwards, we faced the subprime crisis, and eventually the financial crisis also set in. The developed nations, the industrialized nations have eventually started shrinking. There was a demand shrinkage. So what does one need to do in order to retain that kind of growth figures or that kind of growth trajectory? It has to be the domestic economy. And that is why what you find in China is, over the last decade, there's been a huge increase in wages and salaries. That is primarily to increase the purchasing power of the domestic population. So on the other hand, what I feel is, which has been problematic as far as many of the developing world is concerned, that we have a very reductionist definition of development. And it is defined in terms of one number, one numerical variable, that is economic growth. Whereas, in fact, a much more holistic variable exists in the form of the SDGs, which entail all these 4 forms of capital: the natural, human, physical, and social. Now that the UNEP has come up with a notion known as inclusive wealth, by measuring the natural, human, and the physical capital. And between 1990 and 2014, they find that the natural capital has declined. The physical capital has grown at the cost of natural capital in most of the developing world. So, and if one also reads Prime Minister Modi's self-reliance speech, one finds that it is not merely with creating a robust consumption base that will be the driver of the economy, but to create processes and institutions that will steer the economy to paths of prosperity. So slightly in contrast to the age-old classical economic thinking of factors of production in the form of land, labor, capital, and enterprise or entrepreneurship, PM Modi emphasized the need to address land, labor, liquidity, and laws. So laws need to evolve with time, whether in the context of land or labor or finance or infrastructure. They create the institutional processes, and if they do not keep with times, they're increasing the transaction costs of doing business. And these non-monetized transaction costs occur in the form of delays in processing, costs of acquiring information, the bureaucratic shackles, and a host of these issues. So one needs to get over this reductionist delineation of development. And that is precisely why we cannot even rely on this World Bank definition of ease of doing business. This has been refuted by 2-3 publications from the Asian Competitiveness Institute of the National University of Singapore, and they have come up with a separate parameters for ease of doing business, which are much more grounded, much more valid at the ground level. And when we at ORF, we conducted this research, in fact, much prior to the NITI Aayog coming up with the SDG index, and we showed at a subnational level across the Indian states, and we found that the business environment gets substantially ameliorated in those spaces where sustainable development goals have actually been in a much better state. And in fact, even FDI has been flowing to those spaces which has a higher score in terms of the SDGs. So we need a different set of indicators and the different set of parameters, essentially to look at development and eventually to look at business environments. I'd like to stop here.
Thank you very much. I think it was an enriching discussion, and we got 2 different perspectives. One from the development perspective from Dr. Nilanjan, and Mr. Barua actually got the macroeconomic and the financial and banking sector perspective. And it was indeed an enriching session, lots to learn. And I hope the audience also they have benefited from this particular webinar. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Thank you, Mr. Barua, again for taking time out.
Thank you.
And enriching
Thank you,
us
Shangita.
with your thought. And so good night, everyone. Have a great weekend. Thank you.